So folks, you heard me say again, mispronouncing that Christ Mass. Really, that's what the word is, with the exception of the two S's on the end. So I cannot tell you, this is probably one of the years where I have heard people just look me really in the face this year and say, Happy Holidays, almost more than I've ever heard it before. And so it's one of the practices typically that my wife and I, when somebody will greet us with that, they've already opened the door, and we unfortunately will greet that back with Merry Christmas or Merry Christmas, so that because the holidays, Happy Holidays, has really replaced the sense of Christ, the sense of Jesus during this time, what we're celebrating. In fact, I'm sure that you might have even read an article or two that talks about some of the colleges suggesting that there's too much uh, Christian stuff that centers around the Christmas holiday. So if you've not read that, good. I'm glad that you've got a chuckle there. Folks, that's how far away and how far awry we are of understanding what it is that we're doing and the history, how we got here. So if we have universities saying that there's too much Christian stuff going on during Christmas, we're in a really weird place. I think my wife was also in a meeting earlier this week where they were talking about Christmas songs, and someone had said, Go Tell It on the Mountain is not a Christmas song. It's a church song, but it's not a Christmas song. And I think she also said that perhaps his origins were from Great Britain. So you can get from that in some regard that the English don't necessarily, they're not their association with the Bible may not be so much from a faith perspective as it is from a tradition and a we do it every week perspective. So for someone to say, Go Tell It on the Mountain is not a Christmas song, then they don't understand what the words are about. They're singing stuff in a church session and they have no idea what it applies to or what it means. I find that pretty funny. But folks, our society is becoming more that way if not every week, every day.
Very strange to me that it's almost an oxymoron. I mean, there's too much Jesus stuff in Christmas. It's just, I mean, that's just like weird to me, and it indicates
It's
to
probably
me
because they
that
don't associate it anymore with Jesus, and they don't want to associate it with Jesus. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's too much Christian stuff in Christmas. It's like, do you hear what you're saying? It's and when someone says Happy Holidays, I think what I'm going to have to start doing is holidays is a permutation of the word holy days, and we need to ask them perhaps what in the world makes it holy for you. You know, what makes it set apart? Why is it set apart? What's special? So anyway, I'm just bumfuzzled by those comments, Preston, that someone would say too much Christian stuff in Christmas. Okay, well, whatever.
Whatever gets the conversation started, folks. We are living in a world where you've got to be reading and reading the tea leaves around you, that persecution of your Jesus-oriented beliefs and the 66 book tome that we use is going to be one of the key targets to push back in this culture. And so, folks, you've got to start working out. You've got to start using your the knowledge from the troughs from which you've been enjoying food and feeding all of these years. You've got to look forward for those opportunities because we're looking at all sorts of things where I think in Ohio, a teacher was forced to resign because she told folks that using pronouns was against her faith or against her religion. So your religious freedoms that are part of the Constitution here in the United States are not going to protect you pretty soon, and you've got to start figuring out what side of the tug of war potentially you're going to be on. So having said that,
Gene made the comment that he's surprised. I'm not surprised at all because, to most, Christmas is about gift giving, baking cookies, getting together with family. It's nothing to do with Jesus. It's nothing to do with potentially the religious tradition of it. And they want to, they really want to separate themselves from that. I don't believe that, archaic stuff. Christmas is about me putting up a tree, the traditions of baking cookies, family coming over, blah, blah, blah. So it doesn't surprise me at all.
Well, I get that, Ellen, and I agree that there is a degree to which it should not surprise us because, quite frankly, in one sense, they say words don't mean anything. Christmas, Christmas, that's just another word for I want to get together with family and have cookies. On the other hand, they say words mean an awful lot, and if I am identifying as a she and you call me a he, I'm going to get all offended. So they get minutia and offense, and then the big word that says something doesn't mean anything at all. They're so inconsistent. They're so illogical. Norman, coordinate.
So I have to agree with Ellen because Christmas has become so commercialized, and again, it is no longer about Jesus. It's now totally self-centered. What did you say, Nathan?
It's the season of giving and what you can give to me.
There you go.
Give me some gifts.
That's unfortunately what it has become. And so that's why people say happy holidays. So, like when I was out yesterday shopping and somebody said happy holidays to me, I said Merry Christmas. And it's almost like when I said that, some people said, oh, Merry Christmas back. It's almost like they went to the happy holidays first so as not to offend somebody. That's almost what it seemed like yesterday when I was in Walmart, right? Because I was talking to a lady in the baking aisle. We were talking about macaroni and cheese because I was bringing that today to Jean's. Be quiet, Nathan. I have the craziest encounters in the Walmart shopping aisles, right? So we were talking and we were done at the end, and she said happy holidays and I said Merry Christmas. And I'm trying to remember if she said Merry Christmas back to me or not. Some did, but I can't remember if she did or not. But it does seem like they're trying to be inoffensive first. But then if you open the door, then sometimes they'll say it back to you. Sometimes. I think, Chris, you've seen that too. Yeah.
Well, just remember that if they can change it from the Cleveland Indians to the Cleveland Guardians, and they can change it from the Washington Redskins to the Washington Commanders, that it's within the realm of possibility that somebody is going to push to change it from Christmas to winter solstice or something else. So be ready. It's not over.
Right. This isn't just about Christmas, though. I think a lot of Christians in the West, especially, are still thinking of things the way they used to be, and we're really living in what I would say is a post-Christian world. It's not just Christmas; it's Easter. It's whatever the holiday is. They're going to tone it down. They're going to make it about bunny rabbits and jolly fat guys and toys and presents and whatever. But whatever it is, it's not just Christmas. It's everything. It's we've become a post-Christian society.
I have to say, I was taken a little back driving down Hungry Road at the Islamic Center sign that says, "We love Jesus." They do a better job than we do. So anyway, my shirt says Merry Christmas.
Yeah, that mosque down the street from you, actually, I'm sorry I wasn't in town for that day. They actually had a Friday night session where they taught about Jesus in Islamic scripture. So I tried to follow that as best as I could, but I could only get some peripheral and some documentation stuff because they didn't record it to stream it. but I certainly would have appreciated that and appreciated a question and answer session to talk about Isa, who is Jesus in the Muslim faith. You know what? Look, I appreciate those guys hanging out that shingle because, like you say, that's a daring that sometimes Christians don't even present, folks. And when Sarah said what she said about the encounter in Walmart, folks, you know what? Some of this pretense, if I can call it that, is taking hold of folks who profess themselves to be Christians. Those are the folks who are saying happy holidays. And then when Sarah says Merry Christmas, because what they did is they weren't bold. Remember the prayer that I started off this morning, bold confidence, zeal. Those folks are afraid to lead with Merry Christmas. So what they're doing is they're putting the code word out there. And then if you say Merry Christmas to them, then the door is open for them to say Merry Christmas back. But folks, that's the thing that we've been talking about for several years right now. Look, I recognize it sometimes, and Gene always regularly accuses me of being a code talker. So I recognize that 354 days of the year, potentially you need to talk in code. But on Resurrection Day Resurrection Day more so than Easter, and Christmas, those are the times when you don't need to use code. You can come right out and say Happy Resurrection Day as opposed to Happy Easter, Happy Christmas, Happy Christmas, as opposed to Happy Holidays. Folks, that's the kind of boldness, that's the kind of courage, that's the kind of confidence that we need to use, certainly as long as our culture has the door open for us to be able to do that. So that lends itself to our typical question, which is, hey, Jesus encounters. I don't know if Diane's doing her Bible study right now over the past couple of weeks, but Jesus encounters. What do you got? This is the reason for the season. So, what's happened? All right. Hey, Sarah, you can help us if maybe, but folks, you can help. Why are we even considering this? Why? This is crazy stuff. We should just be going to church and putting up garland and singing the songs from the Grinch, holding hands, and making sure that no one steals Christmas this year. Why do we do this?
So why do we do what we do?
Why are we doing, or why are we on the track to do these things that we're discussing? Why are we doing this?
Well, if you go back to our mission statement, is that where you're heading?
Do we have one?
That's what he's trying to prompt, yes.
We do. It's our praying people impacted. It's the praying people equipped by Jesus impacting this world for the next.
Oh. Huh.
Because we are supposed to be the salt and light of the world, right? Or give that message. And it ain't easy. Right? And you may think that family is the easiest ones to talk to, but sometimes they're not. But I mean, we're supposed to be in the world. Let's see, what is it? In the world, but not of the world, or the other way around. I can't remember which way it goes. But basically, we're here, but we're not supposed to be in the trappings of the world, I guess, for lack of a better way to say it, right? Shut up, Nathan. We should be those different examples. He's laughing at me. Those examples, whether we are with our family or out at Walmart in the baking aisle, right? So that's my 2 cents. There you go. I'm not sure why Nathan's laughing at me, but he is.
I just think it's funny that you decided to go with that way of phrasing it. So just like when people look at us, they don't see the world, they see Christ in us and not the world. You went for entrapment of the world. Like, why?
A word that came to mind.
Well, and that I think that her entrapment is actually a good term, because we want to influence the world, but unfortunately we're getting influenced by the world instead. Thus we have the happy holidays test phrase so that we can find out whether or not we're dealing with someone that's part of us rather than just being out there and having the boldness he's talked about. To be in the world and not of the world means that we should not reflect the world back like we do, and I'm guilty of that. Okay, so I get that it is a trap. They do draw us in because if we're going to promote, use that word, but if we're going to promote Jesus the way we ought to, if we're going to be praying people equipped by him to impact this world for the next, we have to reflect him to the world rather than reflecting the world back to itself. And that means bravery, that means boldness, that means courage. And that's not easy. But the first century guys, I appreciate how Preston has reminded us of this. Once they'd seen the risen Christ, it was all over. There was no challenging that. And we need to basically walk in that same sort of mentality. Have we seen the risen Christ? Have we seen him do anything in our lives? Does he make a difference? Or is it Sunday, holidays, go to the park, feed the people, and do whatever we do normally other than that? I think that's a big question.
Appreciate that, Brother Gene. And Sarah, thank you for reminding us about that praying people equipped by Jesus to impact the world for the next. It's a brief statement, but it's certainly one that when you're in Walmart and you have that interaction with the person, if you can remember why we're a family, then the first word is the one that in some ways should help to inspire and help you launch. Praying people.
Okay, and I'm going to just say this because I've been thinking it as you have been drawing this out of us and trying to imprint this upon us. There was a whole group of people that felt like that I was being cultic and trying to get people to say the 4 E's we'd come up with. If that was cultic, what are we doing now? Just saying.
Well, appreciate that, Brother Gene. And for those of us who've been professionals in, say, the corporate world, some of us recognize that it's an important thing to be able to ask your employees what they do or what the mission of our corporation is. I can tell you, in the years that I've been in mental and intellectual health, we had paragraphs that we would have to recite when the CEO or the VP or were around to say that this is what we do. This is a phrase that's this long, and it's even got some of Bruce's and Gene's, and Bruce a little less, Gene more so these days. It's got some alliteration in it. It's got some P's and some neat kind of same letters, sound, and words. So it's pretty easy to remember, because sometimes if you can remember it, that means you might actually be doing it. So I can't tell you, folks, it's always a funny thing for me around this time of year. If me and Ellen, we experience a lot of folks who are churchgoers, who are professed Christians, who get entrapped in what the culture tells us this is supposed to be about. So they've got to have 3 trees up. They've got to have 1 million decorations. They've got to make sure that they are overspending on the gifts because they got to outdo last year. And then on top of that, it's all about family. And folks, that's how churchgoers and professed Jesus believers, that's how we get caught up, because what we don't kill anybody, we don't lie much, we don't have relationships with other people's families much, but what we do is we wind up worshiping our families. So that first institution that the Lord put in place is one that we begin to worship, and the Lord kind of allows us to do that because we forget what's typically on those t-shirts that says the real reason for the season. And so that's why we need to be reminded, folks, that we're praying people equipped by Jesus to impact this world for the next. Because if we really understand the scriptures, that all and anything that we do for Jesus, that's all the stuff that's going to last. So I don't want us to have to be bedridden or to have that stroke or have that aneurysm to have to get reacquainted with that. While we're, for the most part, healthy and hale, let's go ahead and be a kind of Santa where we're delivering the right kind of gifts to all the folks that we encounter. So any last thoughts on that before I jump in and ask you about free sex? Oh, wow. How do you connect those? Huh, okay. So we're continuing our series in regard to answering real life questions using the Bible. By the way, one of the things that I'll do if I don't do it today, and if I don't do it on the Slack line, I think I have to do it on air so that it's recorded, so that folks recognize we haven't taken a tangent or taken an exit without having passages to really refer to. So this is very biblical, even though we may not be reading all of the Bible passages, but it's using the Bible to be able to have the conversations about same-sex relationships, abortion, transsexuality, illegal immigration, climate change. Child indoctrination is what we talked about last week. So there are scriptures that are attached to all this, and I won't give you absolutely all of them. I'll try to give you some key ones to be able to have that top-of-mind awareness, to be able to use them as a go-to when you need to say, this is why I stand for, this is why I believe this. So you heard me mention a phrase before that is almost a 70s-esque kind of phrase, but permeates not only our culture today, but folks, our churches. So we spent a little bit of time with our kids, our family out in Sin City. We told you kind of a couple weeks back. And certainly for, if not the world at large, definitely for their generation, freedom of having sexual intimacy is absolutely endorsed. It's absolutely the practice of our culture today. So, especially because we permit it in church, you know this happens in churches, right? So the Bible must allow us to practice free sex, or does it? You're shaking your head, Sarah. Okay, then where in the Bible might it address that just having sex because it feels good and because it is my right and it's my body and my choice? Where in the Bible might it say that that's not okay?
So I've got a bunch of references, right? But I think the big one is, can't you go back to Song of Solomon?
Okay.
Because, I mean, that talks about it being within a marriage. And I've got a bunch of other ones. I mean, in Genesis, hold on, Nathan. Genesis, Matthew, 1 Corinthians, God designed sex for the physical, emotional, and spiritual union between one man and one woman for life, basically marriage. So that's what I had. I got more, but Nathan's chomping at the bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I just love 1 Corinthians 6, where 18 to 20, where it goes, flee from sexual immorality. Every other sin a person commits is outside the body, but sexually immoral persons sin against their own body. Or do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit within you, whom you have from God? You are not your own, for you were bought with a price. So glorify God with your body.
Okay. So I like 1 Corinthians 6. I have a little bit of a problem with it. Anybody know what my little problem might be with that?
What's his little problem with that?
It's not God.
Not in code.
1 Corinthians 6, and actually one that I like, which is 1 Corinthians 7, 2.
Mhm.
The audience is who?
The church.
Right. So you almost have to go where Sarah's going. Now, and I'm not saying that 1 Corinthians 6 doesn't work, Nate, and I'm not saying that 1 Corinthians 7, 2 doesn't work, because I like that a lot too, except those are being addressed to people who are believers. So you almost have to, in many regards, use the Old Testament here as your standard to be able to say, this is what God intended even before Jesus. And you know what's funny? I actually think I think Brother Gene might have done it. We did a training, a teaching on the Song of Solomon.
Song of Solomon is probably the raciest book in the Bible as you begin to look at some of the implications, some of the imagery there. And so that's an amazing book. But at the same time, there is a man shall leave his mother and father and be joined to his wife. There is that was a very question or thought that came to my mind as we were talking about this. We have to understand, rather than saying don't, let's endorse what God has instituted. As you said, the first institution he's put together is the family, and the whole thing about, marriage. But at the same time, did you know, I don't have the numbers, Steve probably does, divorce is at a higher rate among Christians than it is among unbelievers. And you know why? They're just not getting married.
Right. Surprisingly, the Song of Solomon is also not a book often taught in church, except allegorically. And Song of Solomon is a book to help, especially believers, delight in the fact that God made man for women and women for men. And I like that Brother Gene explained it this way because it's probably the most sober way to talk about it. It is racy if you understand the imagery and understand that their town, our town, what they would have found delightful and provocative. And it's that way because the Lord wants us in the institution that he put together to enjoy each other. And folks, that precedes Jesus coming. And so look, I'm not telling you that using the New Testament complements don't allow you entry into the conversation. You just might have someone who's savvy enough, who's read the Bible, to say, that's being directed to people who are Jesus believers. I'm not a Jesus believer. So then you kind of have to go before the church. And that's going to be anything before you're looking at the advent of Jesus. So Genesis is really going to work. Leviticus is going to work. Deuteronomy, Numbers is going to work. Ecclesiastes, Proverbs, those guys really come into play when we're talking about free sex. And then you can supplement them certainly with a lot of New Testament.
I think when
right. So wait a minute. Go ahead, Bruce. Wait a minute. So if I take that logic, then why, when I start quoting the Old Testament, don't they say, well, that was just for the Jews?
Because especially when we take a look at Genesis, there were no Jews.
But the Old Testament was for the Jews. That was the entire Old Testament was written for the Jews.
Okay. So
yeah,
thank you.
That's where I was going to, Bruce. And this is one of the issues I think we have when we're trying to use Scripture to validate Christian values and come against, if you can use it that way, against the values of the world, because the values of the world don't include a validity of Scripture.
And I'm just speaking. I'm just speaking as a representative for the lost world. I get where you're at, but I've seen this same thing thrown in my face and others, particularly when you deal with same sex and homosexuality and all that, and you quote that, and all of a sudden it's like, oh wait, that's for them. And so I'm just, it starts to reduce to the ridiculous. But yeah, just as a point.
No, I appreciate it, because if you were doing this training, I would do the same thing to you. So I appreciate that. My argument and my pushback on that would include I need a little bit of time with this person with whom I'm discussing to be able to say, because Brother Steve is going to get on this wagon, at least for the next question. But this next question, the answer to the next question is a lot of the establishment of a lot of the pushback on many of these categories. So certainly the Jews had the written information about creation and Yahweh first, but that didn't mean other cultures didn't. And that's where the pushback in some ways would be. That we have Job, who we believe is the first book of the Bible, in a pagan culture. They knew who Yahweh was, and that far preceded the Levites and Moses and the establishment of Abraham. So you need a little bit more time to help people understand how this information predates even the Jews, and it applied to mankind in general. I would say start your conversation early in the morning and make sure that you've got energy bars, because that's how you're going to have to be able to promote that. Or that, exactly. Because, folks, the book of Genesis is for mankind as a whole. And certainly, Pastor Bruce is right on target, saying that from Abraham, that's where these guys get it written and codified. But, folks, it didn't mean that mankind didn't know about this sooner.
So to sort of play off of Bruce a little bit and sort of take the world's position because it's fun. So if we're talking about one man and one woman, and this is an argument that you might hear a lot. David is called a man after God's own heart. David has multiple wives, right? So it's not one man, it's one man, many women. You've got Abraham, God's friend, right? More than one wife. Yep. So what's the counter to that?
Okay, Steve, you're making that too easy. So the fact that God's plan was God's plan and mankind decided to bend it a little bit, and then later on, I guess I have to draw people to the New Testament to give Jesus's response, which was, you folks are hard-headed and you didn't like it the way that God asked you to do it. So he permitted you to go awry in this. And then the other part that's not written there is Jesus doesn't say, and he didn't smite you. Right? So you're absolutely right that Abraham has his wife's handmaiden, and then his wife, and then later has another wife and concubines and has kids, and that David has multiple wives. But Jesus explains, and this is you got to have a long conversation to be able to draw the two together, is Jesus says that wasn't Yahweh's intent. He allowed that because you were hard-headed. And then he doesn't add, and he didn't smite you. So I dig that. I appreciate that, Brother Steve. Folks, Yahweh's original plan was that a man would leave his house, and I'm going to be a little bit silly with some of this, and in a sense of having an arranged marriage, would go and meet someone from another household that was trusted, and that man and that woman would cleave to each other and leave their respective households and start their own. And their new household would be established for their lives. And if one of them predeceased the other, they would then be allowed to re-establish a family. That was Yahweh's original plan. We have completely bent and reshaped, reframed, and redefined what Yahweh's plan was. And part of that happens because no one got smited. Or let me actually use the right past participle. No one got smouted. No one got smouted. Okay, good. Thank you, Tim. Right. No one got smouted. And so, Smouted. No one got smouted. And sometimes when there's no immediate smouting, when somebody doesn't get blowed up right after something happens, the lesson doesn't really kind of stick. Go ahead, Gene.
I got nothing. I just left it on because I thought I was going to have something, but there's a couple things there. Number one, when we see Old English messed up in tenses, for one, and number two, it reminds me of something that I think we're getting to in another discussion. The immediate result of a mistake, and I'm going to put it in those terms, because the giraffe has been designed in such a way that the blood pressure that's required to get the blood to the brain up that big old long neck is huge. But when they bend down to drink some water, there's a valve that prevents that from, blowing their head into the water. So the first time a giraffe went to go get a drink and didn't have that valve, there was a mistake when they went to go get a drink, and it was an immediate result. And, I've got to develop a valve to prevent that, and thus evolution. So the point I'm making is obviously a silly one. At the same time, sometimes we need to understand that God is so gracious in letting us go and go and go and go and go until eventually he will say, okay, that's enough.
So, Brother Gene, that's a terrific point, and I was actually going to build on that a little. Thank you for kind of reading my mind, because the next question is going to be about evolution, and I think that Brother Gene, Brother Steve, and I think Pastor Bruce and I will all be in agreement as to what the rebuttal is for that, but it's going to, again, take coffee and energy bars because you're going to get major pushback here. But Brother Gene is correct in saying this thing, folks, and the older I get, when I deign to spend some time in this courtyard, the more understanding from my limited mind as a human I can get about this. Because the Lord because he's eternal, for real, not immortal, but because he's eternal, because he is omnipotent and omniscient, he has an ability to wait on junk that we don't. When something pinches us, when something bothers us, we feel if we don't have pent up yuck, we sometimes feel the need to just explode. He doesn't need to do that way. In fact, he's got an explosion of sorts planned, but it's planned when he says it's planned. So in the time frame that we think that someone should get chastised and it doesn't occur, we think that there's nothing going on there because we don't understand the eternality of Yahweh God. We don't understand how long suffering he can be because he is eternal. So it doesn't mean that there's not chastisement, there's not judgment, there's not a penalty for doing the things that displease Yahweh God. It's just the fact that he's eternal, and it doesn't have to happen in our 70 years of life, because 70 years is not even a blip to Yahweh. And that's why, folks, when Chris,
I think there's a number of examples in the Old Testament where the penalty was not enforced upon the offender, but second, third, and fourth generations down, or likewise, conversely, blessed third, fourth, and fifth generations down.
Yeah, I think you're right, Chris, because that's how the Lord can promise that there'll be a king in the line of David on the throne forever, because he's eternal and omniscient. And we don't get that, especially when we watch all the frailty and the the foibles that are a part of David and his progeny. So Brother Gene's comments lend itself to our next to last topic. And that topic is evolution. And you know what's funny? I was probably a lot more primed during my lifetime to have the discussion about evolution. And that has almost disappeared from the landscape today. And it's almost disappeared from the landscape today because we're not living in a world where truth is important, discovering the truth, discerning the truth is important, and we're not in a world where facts that are provable enter into an argument. We're in a world and in a culture, in a climate I can tell you I comfortably never imagined. I never imagined where if you say up is down and I say up is up, if I don't agree with you, there's something wrong with me. And potentially my livelihood is at risk because I don't agree that you said that up is down. I could never have foreseen that we would be in a place where folks would not recognize truth. Especially because in many ways, Jesus in his exchange with Pontius Pilate says, you shall know the truth and the truth shall set you free. I guess I thought that if you had a discussion with a reasonable person, and at some point in time you introduced truth and truisms, that they would embrace the truth because in the face of seeing truth or falsehoods, they would understand that truth is what they needed to embrace. Folks, that's not the time we live in. So this evolution discussion, in many ways, for the arguments that I prepared, just don't work anymore. And that's one of the wonderful reasons I appreciate Brother Steve bringing the information that he brings to help me to keep on a little bit more of a cutting edge of how to push back in this conversation. Because all the facts and information and history from both archaeology and then the Bible don't matter in the same way to this culture if they don't feel like dinosaurs and men coexisted. Or if they don't feel like global warming was an issue 50 billion years ago, but it's only an issue over the past 150 years. So, what's the Bible's argument for or against evolution?
I'm gonna bet before Steve does because he's going back to Genesis 1:1.
Yeah, and that's where I was going to jump in too.
Yeah, in the beginning, God created, right? So it's God created it. I mean, yeah, thanks, Steve. But I mean, that's like the very first thing you can go to.
And that also gives us, in the Hebrew, a plurality of God as well. So we have a Trinity revealed in the word Elohim. And the funny part about that, again, like you said, Preston, the fact that it doesn't matter what's true, it matters how they feel. I just don't feel like that was God. You know, I feel like it's that kind of goes back to the whole, there's too much Christian stuff in Christmas. It doesn't matter, you know. So anyway, but in the beginning, a lot of folks, I think, miss this, and this is just me ranting, okay? In the beginning, God. If it's the beginning, how can there be something other than God starting it? Think about this for just a moment, okay? In the beginning, before there was anything else, God is still already there. And we need to understand that first. And again, the pushback is going to come, well, that's for the Jews, or that's for the Judeo-Christian ethic. That's for people. I just don't feel that anymore. And so it's like, you're right. There's just no, it just kind of goes back to the evolutionists that was brought to an archaeological dig where they had a man's footprint fossilized within a dinosaur footprint. And, the two existed at the same time, and he, with his back to it, says, I don't see anything here that contradicts, evolution. Their truth and science, unless it's of course supports them, it doesn't matter anymore.
There's also references that in Psalms that only the fool says there is no God, right? So, I think it's also, it might be in Proverbs too. I wrote down Proverbs 1:7 and Psalms 14:1 and 53:1, but I think, only a fool is going to deny that there's God.
Yeah, and so now we're back to now theism, number one. Number two, we're back to not one but two references about the foolishness of denying God in Preston's favorite book of the Bible. So there's just so much fun there.
You got to drill down a little bit deeper though, because even if somebody accepts God, they can still posit evolution. I mean, famously, sadly, Millard Erickson wrote one of the best systematic theology books ever. And he posits what's called theistic evolution. And so, claiming God's not enough.
Right.
Especially if you're talking to a believer. And I think you've got to grab this phrase that's all over Genesis 1, and it shows up again, by the way, in Genesis 6 with the flood. And this is the words: after its kind. After its kind. The Bible is telling us in ancient language that God not only created everything, he created it within its species. And that's a very important thing to recognize, is that there's not drift between species. After its kind is a very Bible phrase that speaks to a very specific scientific truth that everybody, if I can use a 21st century phrase, everything's in its own lane. And that's where it stays. It was created that way, and it's still that way today.
And this is where we've gotten in trouble as a Christian
Oh.
community with the world at large in two ways. Number one, rather than acknowledging that there is evolution in a micro level and after its kind, we've decided, nope, that evolution's bad altogether, so we're going to deny it all, which again, scientifically, is not the case. Number two, the day age or the gap theory were other ways that theistic evolution has been able to raise its head. And again, we're going, well, because we can't go with that, we're going to throw it out altogether. So I think we need to be very careful to do things basically like Preston said. Let's do it with our minds in gear as opposed to just knee-jerk reaction to it and saying, nope, I don't feel like that's right anymore.
I appreciate Pastor Bruce talking about not only several places in Genesis, but Genesis 6. And again, you're going to need coffee, you're going to need energy bars, you're going to need folks to be able to buckle in, because you got to go through the first 10 chapters of Genesis. And in the first 10 chapters of Genesis, there's enough information to push back on the concept of macro evolution. Certainly, we have indicators in our culture that show us microevolution. And I like where Brother Gene was and Pastor Bruce was on the doorstep here. We just didn't have a Christian savvy enough during the 19th century to be able to understand how microevolution coexisted with creation. And so they just failed. They failed, and then they gave up and allowed the worldly concepts to come into Christian sermons and Christian identity. That's why you get me talking about Darwin, then we have to talk about Darby, John Darby. We got to talk about Moody. We got to talk about the Scofield Bible. All of those things are important. Sometimes failures of Christians to understand how to push back on new ideals that were happening during this time of kind of the Great Awakenings, right? Because 1830s, that's where Darwin, 1830s, 1840s, John Darby, that's where a lot of these guys are coming into play. That's also where the Latter-day Saints came out. So the 19th century were places where there were new insights to Christianity, and Christians weren't locked in enough to be able to push back on those. Pentecostalism comes out of the 19th century. A lot of that stuff comes into play, folks. And so almost like today, Christians get, and thank you so much for reminding us about this, Sarah. We unfortunately are in the world and we're of the world. And that's why we're doing this side study to help us understand, folks, we can be in the world, but we need to recognize that our familyship is otherworldly. And we need to understand the aspects of our other citizenship to be able to say, I'm sorry, no. I'll let you finish your point, but let me tell you why that's not quite right. Pastor Bruce? Did you have something there, Bruce?
You used a word that for a moment stalled me. I had to reflect on it for a little bit. You do this to me all the time, actually. Family ship. I'm like, okay, what boat's he talking about? Oh, wait a minute. He's talking about where our family relationships are and that kind of thing. Okay, now and then I got caught up. But at the same time, there's an old gospel song. This world is not my home. I'm just passing through. And when we get to that realization, we understand that we're not really called to please the folks around us except to draw them to Jesus. Like you said, strap in, get your, stay awake stuff going on, whatever that might be. And, engage in a conversation, in a polite, loving conversation. It's kind of like teaching. When you're a teacher, it is not your job to be a friend of the student. Okay? A lot of folks go into teaching and they say, I'm going to be the cool teacher. I'm going to be the one that everyone likes. That's not the job. The job is to instruct, and that may mean correction. And this is where the grace is missed a lot of the time. When we have to correct, when we have to get out our red pencil, when we have to mark things up and say, no, this isn't right, we have to be able to do that with a loving attitude, but at the same time, we have to be firm with it. Same thing is true when dealing with people who are misguided by the culture in which we live. We have to be able to get our red pencil out and go, no, there's a degree to which there's truth here, but at the same time, you have to understand where that line is and say, no, it's no longer that. You need to understand that this is the truth, and there is a line that is definitive and intellectual that you can ride on. I remember a fellow we knew at one time who had a doctorate in theology, and I asked him one time. He was a pastor at a Baptist church, and I asked him one time about Genesis, and for a professing Christian, he said, well, that was all allegory. And I'm like, in what way does that even benefit us if it's allegory? So I guess I'm too much of a computer geek and logical to make any sense of some of this stuff. This whole culture that we're in just really messes with my brain.
Could we send them to Job when God answered Job's questions about how he created? I mean, I was just looking at some of the things that he told Job, and one of the ones that came up when I looked this up was where it is, just
Where
saw
were
it.
you when I hung the stars?
Right, and then they also talked about the behemoth and the Leviathan, which
Leviathan.
yeah, which aren't, I guess, aren't around anymore from the descriptions, but that's pretty clear what he did and how he did it, and who are you to tell him anything?
And the exciting part about the book of Job, and I mentioned this earlier, and this is why you need somebody to lock in with their coffee, their energy bars, whatever, and you've got to have a little bit of a relationship because it's going to take a little time to make this make sense. The book of Job kind of predates all of the written aspects of the other books. And the culture from which Job comes he's not Jewish. He's not Abrahamic. So this is Yahweh encountering a guy who loves Yahweh, who's not a Jew, and yet when he visits him to rebuke or rebuff his attitude, he says, "You don't understand the nature of me. You don't understand not only the nature of me, but what I've done. Who are you to question me?" And that kind of humility falls in we struggle with our own hubris to have that kind of a Job encounter because we like to believe with technology and school and education and all of our gestalt that we pretty much know what we know. Job has to encounter his creator and pretty much has nothing to say. And his creator didn't need to visit with him, except he thought it important enough to visit his creation and say, let's have a discussion about this. And so if you can, with this person with whom you're having a conversation, have them wait and understand enough to say, this is how grand our creator is. To the point where when he encounters his creation, he says, you don't understand anything. There was a time, I think, where that kind of humility would work among even the American people. I think we're at a time where not only are we not humble, but we don't accept truth as truth. And so that Job encounter is always one that makes my mind real. That the Lord not only shows up, but challenges him in a way to say, you need to shut up. You don't know nothing. And you heard Sarah mentioning some of this stuff before when she's talking about the foolishness of man. Lean not to your own understanding. That's the culture we're in right now, where our own understanding is all we want to know. And that's not the beginning of wisdom. That's downright foolishness. And that's our society right now. And so when Brother Gene brilliantly references, usually my go-to is the woodpecker. But Brother Gene went even better than that, which is almost a physical illustration of understanding how a giraffe operates. And in the scheme of evolution, that giraffe and its species would all have to die out. And then another kind of giraffe 2.0 would have to be on the scene in order to eradicate the issue that was the previous generation's downfall. And that has to happen a myriad of times in order for us to get the giraffe that we know today. That doesn't make a lot of sense. Number two, you need to know a little bit about Darwin, who was not equipped to be able to make some of the postulates that he made. And understand, you need more than several billions of years for the monkey to type out all the works of Shakespeare, because it doesn't happen that way. And so when Brother Gene is trying to say, in the beginning, God, and out, we seem to agree, or seemed at least 20 years ago to agree, that you can't have something come out of nothing. But we're less inclined to believe that now. We want to think that there's just spontaneous. The Big Bang created everything spontaneously because there was absolutely nothing before then. And the funny thing is, they may have the science right, and at one point in time, they actually agreed that some entity caused the Big Bang, but we're less there these days. So that encounter with Job, I love it. And if you've got a friend that will sit with you often enough and have the humility to let you get to that point, bravo. Let me also throw out into the ring, and then you guys can feedback because we're winding down. I used to be very, very pessimistic about the decisions and the life choices that Ellen and my kids have made, because they just are, almost diametrically opposed to their household and what it is that they were brought up with. But I've actually begun to thank the Lord recently, especially with our last trip, because I'm getting a chance to practice a lot of the stuff we're talking about right now with my kids. Now, the funny place is I'm at a place maybe differently than Diane or Sherry or Sarah might be, or even my wife, in that I kind of understand being in agreement with Yahweh God, that's saying that if my kids don't agree that the truth is the truth, then that's their decision. And I'm in agreement with what Yahweh's response to that is. But while we're all alive together, I'm going to practice all this stuff that we're talking about right now. So when Steve puts those apologetics together and they're presented to be able to push back on today's climate and culture, and sometimes verbiage I don't even know, I'm trying to take that to heart and then practice this stuff with my own kids. So some of these categories, my wife and I kind of had an opportunity to go through these with my kids over the course of 3-4 days. Not necessarily successful, but working out doesn't mean that you're successful all the time. It just means you're getting comfortable working out. And so I thank the Lord for that opportunity to be able to put some of these ideals into practice in talking to people who are non-believers. So let me be quiet there, give you some opportunity to comment. Thank you, Diane, about the Job. Job rocks.
I was going to say, if you really want to have some fun, although it might be dangerous to take this route when it comes to evolution, because you might get sidetracked. But if you, in today's culture and climate, when it comes to racism, in regards to evolution, if you just ask them what the title of Darwin's book was, it might open some eyes. Because if you're unfamiliar, everybody thinks it's On the Origin of the Species. But the full title is On the Origin of the Species by Means of Natural Selection or the Preservation of Favored Races in the Struggle for Life. So if you bring that up to people, especially in today's climate, they may have to reevaluate their opinion of Darwin.
Well, I think you also, in order to do that, you need to read it, because the word race in his time and in his terminology is actually being used interchangeably with the word species. Okay, and so that's important, because we Preston and I are not two different species.
Correct.
We are both Homo sapiens. And I was talking to this lady I mentioned a few weeks ago at the AutoZone. You cut us, we both bleed the same color. Okay, we are the same. If you're going to go with race, there is only one race among people, the human race. Okay, so but understanding the time period, understanding the verbiage, understanding the vocabulary, our town, their town kind of thing, you need to understand that when he uses the word race, he's not talking about difference in color of skin or culture, Black, Asian, Native American, whatever. He's not talking any of that. He's talking the words species and race are the same in his mind. Back to one other thing, and it really kind of concerns me. Preston said that it was back in the 1830s, we have Pentecostalism rising up. To me, and this is just me now, you don't have to adopt this, to me, that's an indication that there was a drive from emotionalism rather than intellect, rather than the mind working. I want to experience this, and so I don't care. Just turn my mind off. I'll go to church and let happen what happens. Let's keep our minds engaged when we come to church, and so that when we leave church it's still engaged, and we can actually exercise that toma in such a way that we're able to engage the culture in which we live in a manner that will make sense to them. The problem is now the culture's gotten to a place where it's all about their imagination, they're all about their emotions, and as Preston said, truth doesn't really matter anymore. Evidence doesn't really matter. It's all how I feel. And today I feel like a cheeseburger. Tomorrow I may feel like I'm going to be a bird. And but that may smack into reality, pardon the pun, when you try to fly off the roof. So.
Yeah, but see, the whole issue is here, and going back to what Preston said about the 19th century, two thoughts. One, Darwin was operating without anything that came from Mendel, who hadn't put all that work together yet as far as genetics, basic genetics. So, I mean, you got to think he was pretty uninformed to come up with all of these ideas, and that should have just made people stop in their tracks. But they were looking for a solution that didn't include God, obviously, and so that helped them. But the other thought that I had, and I think it's helpful for us in the 21st century, science up until then had been really kind of in a place to prove God, not disprove God. Archaeology, all of that, right, was focused on we're affirming that this is God's world. And then there was a sea change, and it was like, well, we're looking for things that don't prove God, that disprove God. And the sad thing is, and you mentioned Schofield and some of those other things, they weren't prepared for that. They just weren't prepared. They didn't, in their imagination, they couldn't think that the world would turn on God, and so it took them a while before Christian, and not Christian scientists, but Christian scientists started to bring evidence forward that would proclaim the truths of Scripture and refute those. And then you had the entire idea of apologetics that started to really gain traction. And so I think the caution for us today, right now, is don't be surprised by anything the world brings forward, that the world wants to disprove God. And so because we are continually shocked by what the world presents, we're always reactive, and we always look angry. We always look upset. And we should just wake up in the morning remembering that the gospel is foolishness to those who are perishing. That is the reality of Scripture. God warned us about it. It's in our Bible. He told us lost people going to act like lost people, and they're going to do silly, crazy, godless things. And yet we are constantly on our heels, constantly looking upset, as opposed to waking up going, oh, okay, another foolish thing that you're doing. Let's respond. Let's not react. Let's respond. And that's why I appreciate lots of times the tenor with which Steve brings data forward, because it's always very much, I can imagine Steve taking the same things that he says, and you other guys as well, but just the way that Steve brings the science forward, that I can see him doing the same thing at a table in a coffee shop with somebody who absolutely defies all Scripture. That would be the same conversation as it is here today. And that's how we need to really step into it. And I got to tell you, when you get to evolution, that's the one that gets my blood boiling. So it takes extra prayer before you engage in that. But just a thought there, as you said that, I just wanted to say that's a challenge for us in 2022 as well.
I appreciate you saying that, Pastor Bruce, that certain of these topics makes your blood boil. Especially one of the things I loved about Brother Gene is learning that he was very, very much an evolution apologetics master. The funny part about the culture we live in today is that's not really an issue anymore that folks want to talk about. that are of today's culture, they're going to tell you that boys are girls and girls are trucks, and trucks should be filled with gas, and the gas can make you float. And if some days you feel like you're going to float, some days you feel like you're made of lead. And all of that is normal and natural, and that's genetic, and it's biological, and it's truth. So, evolution kind of flies out the door when, for the most part, whatever you think is the reality you live in, and you need to force that on me. And that's the one that I struggle with the most, is listening to people tell me that things that aren't are, and that I should believe with my own eyes, even though the emperor is naked, that he's wearing magical clothes, but he's not. So part of the reason I enjoy this group of worshipers is because there's wonderful expertise and experience among us. And there are things that I learn not only from my preparation, but from our time together, that helps me to go out and to do what Pastor Bruce said, is to not be reactive, but to respond, to recognize that every day when I go to Sam's or Costco or Walmart or Aldi or Lidl or Publix, that crazy is in the midst. And instead of me going, no, 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 I need to have a way to respond to crazy. I need to invite the conversation and say, do you realize that crazy is as crazy does? And I don't know if you really want to be crazy. Because hell doesn't frighten our contemporaries today. Pleasing Yahweh God doesn't frighten our colleagues, our comrades, our neighbors today the way it did 50 years ago. The afterlife and what happens doesn't frighten people the way it used to, because your own reality is kind of what you believe is going to be your ending. So, gang, this study that we're in, and we haven't gotten to the last one, and we'll get to that next week, and I'll remind you what that is. We've got to be able to represent what we stand for, and not be able to have a rule book that says you can't, you don't. Because sometimes when you can present in a responsive way, not a reactive way, all the benefits to people, and that's sometimes what Jesus believers don't do well. We don't recognize and tell folks about our freedoms and why we have our freedoms. Instead, we pretty much want to admonish folks and say, bad, 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 you can't. And certainly interacting with my own kids is helping me to better say what Jesus is about, as opposed to, you're just bad, bad kitties. Let me hit you on the nose. Where's that newspaper? And the practice is helping me maybe to get better at what Sherry said that she struggles with sometimes, which is, as opposed to, I'm going to pray for you, let's pray. Let's pray. And part of the reason I'm praying for you is because I believe a conversation with the Creator matters. And I think it's of great importance, more so maybe for you than it is for me right now. And so I'm going to exercise my connection, my connectivity, my relationship, hopefully leverage for you right now. That's a benefit that I have. And doggone it, I'm going to use it. And I like Pastor Bruce reminding us, when we're reactive, that's when we're ready to Mike Tyson you. When we're responsive, that's where the ability to have a dialogue the way that Steve presents some of these folks, that's going to become more of our nature. And folks, that's what we want to be able to do. We want to be able to turn every conversation into a Jesus opportunity. And we do it because we're not revulsed or repulsed by people. And if we are, we're able to keep that away from our eyes and our face. Sarah, we're able to keep that away from our eyes and our face. And the thought bubble doesn't immediately go, almighty smiter, could you just smite them? And just in the course of a conversation to be able to say, does that really benefit you? How does that ultimately work out for you? What does ultimately mean for you? What happens after you die? Does that matter to you? And that's a response more so than a almighty smiter, please smite of thou, smite of thee, smout, just whatever you're going to do. So I'm done for this week. Your responses, your comments.
Preston,
Yeah,
listening to you
yeah, Doc.
talk and listening to all this going on, I think we need to remember as we go out and engage, we're as filthy rags ourselves. It's only because of Jesus that we stand. I mean, under the free love, I wanted to say so bad, there's this verse that Jesus told us. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart.
Yep.
We're as filthy rags. It doesn't matter how far we've come along in our faith, we still are working on our sinful selves. And we will be until the day we die. And maybe these topics that we're discussing are huge, and our sin seems so small, but it's still sin.
Mhm.
So going from that humility is the key to being able to engage people, I think.
I think your point
Yeah.
also is well made, Preston, that we're so far removed, more than just 20 centuries from the first century and their mindset. In the first century, you had Jewish people who were looking for a Messiah, and you had pagans who wanted to please the gods that they felt like were basically active in either good or bad that happened in their lives. Now, there's no seeking of God at all, and there's no fear of any sort of deity. And so we've basically made man their own deity. And so there's no seeking, there's no looking, there's no fear. There's no fear of what will happen at the end, because there's no concept that there is going to be an end. I'm going to be a truck until I'm not. And then I'll be something else. I'm going to be it just doesn't matter. They've even, by the way, back to our whole Christmas conversation, they've even put that into commercials. And I'm going to finish with this because it's just disturbing to me. Jewelry is a popular gift for Christmas. Okay? And now they've got this commercial out. Boy meets girl. Girl meets boy. Boy meets boy. Brother.
Well, you know what Diane said, I think is really, and I haven't seen that commercial, Gene, thank the Lord. I don't know how I missed it, but what Diane said is so vitally important. I was following a car yesterday after our prayer outreach. I was following a car home. I'm not creepy. I didn't follow her all the way to her home, but I was following this woman on the road, and on the left-hand side of the back of her car, she had all these little one-line slogans: "Love is love," "Black Lives Matter," all those sorts of things, right? All the sloganeering we've seen over the last 3 years. And I noticed that on the right-hand side, we call it a safety check here. We put it on the bottom right-hand side of our bumper, our state inspection. And it has the month and the year on it. And hers was expired. And I thought, okay, so you're wanting us to see your slogans, and you're wanting us to comply, but you are driving around in an unsafe vehicle. So kind of all your love kind of goes out the window. Basically, you're wanting us to comply, but you don't have to, is kind of the message I got from that. But what Diane just said is true as well. We do a lot of sloganeering as Christians, but do we comply with God's commands? Do we comply with God? And I've seen this show up in church services a few times lately, because I typically want to have some aspect in my sermon of evangelism, right? To do the plan of salvation. And I'll say sometimes, we're not calling you out for being any worse than we are. All of us were born in sin as well. We're just saved by the grace of God. And it's funny because sometimes when I say that, I see people look at me a little bit askance, like, what? I what? It's like we've forgotten the before picture of that whole thing. So, I think the underlying theme to this whole thing is personal responsibility. as if we can win the arguments and the apologetics, but if we don't get it to the point, it's like, look, the reason I'm telling you this is because you have to stand before a holy and righteous God one day. And by the way, so do I. If we can't draw that, I mean, isn't that the whole thing of evangelism? We've got to find commonality. We've got to find something that's in common, not us versus them, but you and me together. We'll stand before a holy and righteous God one day. I don't know, that humility sometimes does get lost in the shuffle of all these things. And it becomes in our world today about, I won.
We're on the heels of Pastor Bruce presenting that. I want to mention next week's final topic, I think, unless you guys have some, and then I want to comment with what Bruce just mentioned. Next week we're going to talk about a suicide and assisted suicide, because if you're reading your news, you had another couple this week, and typically that you're reading those when you're finding people that are of an age where typically they would be dead. They're usually between about 25 and 45 or so, and you're reading the reports of their demise, but they don't have the details. And then later, if you keep reading the articles that are related, they keep trickling out where there's notes and there's other things. So, for instance, the last week has been the guy who was the DJ on the Ellen DeGeneres show. And if you look at his life and if you look at what his legacy seemed to be and what his family said, he had absolutely every reason to live, yet determined that killing himself was the best route. So we're going to talk about that, and if there's pushback in the scriptures next week. And I want to say, I appreciate Diane. Diane's always she's one of those little angels on my shoulder that I try to punch. But I appreciate that she's there for me to attempt to punch, and I'm very rarely successful. It doesn't mean I don't try. And Pastor Bruce brought up a point that bolstered kind of what Diane said. And so always when I'm having this conversation, especially with my kids, but if I do this with other folks, I try to have Penn Jillette in my mind. And Penn Jillette is a part of that duo, Penn and Teller. And this thing that this atheist, this guy who does not believe in God, this thing that he said always permeates my discussions. And that's what I try to use to keep me thinking about subduing my pride, to besting you. Because what he said, paraphrased, is, if you believe that you know what is best for me, then I would respect you needing to tell me. And so what I'm trying to remember is not that I'm going to beat you in this chess game, not that I'm going to whip you and toss across, not that I'm going to out beanbag toss you and put the kibosh on you and kill you. It's, I know something perhaps you don't know. And if I care enough about you, either because I just met you or because I've got a deeper sense about how valuable your life can be here and later, I need to tell you something. And then if it doesn't work, it's not my job to change the person's heart. So I don't need to clobber them the way I think I used to when I was a younger guy. I don't need to beat you up. I don't need to pulverize you. I don't need to play four-dimensional chess and feel like I've won on two different levels. I need to tell you. And that atheist comment is what I keep in my head when I'm having conversations with people. Yeah, absolutely, Gene. To say, I know where there's food. I know where there's sustenance. I know where there's rest. I know where there's peace. I'm obligated to tell you. You don't have to accept it, but I have to tell you while we're together. And that's going to change my Aldi visit. That's going to change my American Family Fitness visit. That's going to change my Christmas dinner with my family visit if I know that there are folks who don't know where there's eternal food, where there's eternal water, where there's eternal peace. So I'm done there. Thanks for letting me cut into your time, Brother Steve, Brother Gene. Thoughts, other stuff as we spiral down?
May I share a couple of thoughts that have been relative, but on a very, very, very tangent sort of thing. We've mentioned the gym a few times. Two things about that. And this is just, like I said, it has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but we've mentioned the gym, and I just feel like I want to say this just as a parting chuckle for you. Number one, I saw somebody say that this week's goal, go to the gym. Next week's goal, go inside. and then I heard this other one about these folks that said, I was going to go to the gym, but I couldn't find a parking place close to the door. That's all I got.
Okay. You folks are now better in touch with additional things to pray for Gene about. So make sure you layer those. Before we close off and pray, I gotta give some kudos to Brother Nathan, and here's why. He closed this in prayer last week, and there are some folks among us who said, one of the things I struggle with is how do I praise the Lord when I pray? Because folks, look, a lot of us longtime Christians spend a whole lot of time thanking the Lord. You listened to Nate's prayer last week. Nate was giving a wonderful workshop in how to honor the Lord because of simply who he is how to lift the name of Jesus or honor Yahweh without thanking him for stuff either that he's going to do or that he's done. It's just recognizing the power of who he is. So if you've got Rewind and you've got the access to revisit that, not only was it right on target, I'm telling you, I was elated and very excited afterwards because the content was a how-to workshop on if you need to figure out how to praise the Lord and how to understand just who he is and have a prayer that's just dedicated to that. Nate was right on that last week. Thank you for that, Nate. I was wonderfully excited and bouncing after that because I guess I haven't heard somebody pray like that in quite some time because we spend a whole lot of time asking for stuff, asking for people, thanking the Lord, and that wasn't what you prayed about at all last week. In fact, when you're talking about that we're sucking and you're not, well, that's the kind of mindset that sometimes helps us know thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Hallowed be your name.